The late afternoon sun beat down on the dusty plains, casting long, wavering shadows across the open land. Jim Calloway rode slowly, slumped forward in the saddle, his hat tilted low to shield his weary eyes. The dry wind tugged at the edges of his worn-out coat, and his boots hung limp in the stirrups, caked with layers of dust collected over too many miles. There was a time when Jim's posture had been proud, his hands firm on the reins and his eyes sharp as a hawk's. But now, his shoulders sagged under the invisible weight of loss, and his once fiery spirit had dimmed to a flicker. He had been riding for days with no real direction, driven more by the need to escape than any desire to arrive. The trail behind him was long and filled with ghosts' faces he couldn't forget, voices that haunted his dreams. Once, not so long ago, he had a ranch, a family, and a future he believed in. But the drought had come hard and stayed longer than any of them expected. The cattle died slow, pitiful deaths. His savings dried up just as surely as the riverbed behind his land. And then came the fire, accidental or not, he never found out. What mattered was that it took everything. His barn, his livestock, even the last picture he had of his wife and baby boy. He hadn't stayed to sift through the ashes. There was nothing left to salvage. Just memories, scorched and brittle. So he saddled up his old horse Rusty, a loyal companion, if there ever was one, and left it all behind. Since then, he had taken odd jobs along the way, mending fences, wrangling strays, guarding freight wagons through rough terrain. Enough to earn food and feed for Rusty, enough to stay alive, though barely. Now, as he rode across another endless stretch of sun-baked land, Jim felt the familiar ache settled deep in his bones. He wasn't old 40, maybe a year or two past, but grief ages a man faster than time. His hands, once calloused from work, trembled slightly on the reins. His stomach grumbled, but he ignored it. Hunger had become just another quiet companion. He was just about to press Rusty forward over a small rise when he noticed something strange, a movement on the side of the road. Almost too small to notice. At first, he thought it was a couple of stray animals, maybe dogs scrounging for scraps. But as he drew nearer, his tired eyes focused on the shapes. Two children, twin girls, no more than 8 or 9, sat close together in the thin shade of a leaning mesquite tree. Their dresses were torn and dirty, their faces streaked with dust and dried tears. One clutched a worn rag doll to her chest as if it were made of gold. The other stared blankly at the horizon, as if waiting for someone who might never come. Neither of them moved when Jim approached. They didn't run. They didn't speak. They just looked up at him with hollow eyes that stopped him cold. He dismounted slowly, careful not to startle them, though something in their stillness told him they were beyond fear. Rusty stood nearby, blowing soft breaths through flared nostrils, sensing the change in his rider's energy. Jim crouched low, his knees protesting. "You girls all right?" he asked softly, unsure what else to say. They said nothing. The one with the doll gripped it tighter. Jim's heart twisted. He had seen children abandoned before orphans left in the wake of war, sickness, or just plain cruelty, but something about these two struck deeper. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was the way they sat so close, like two halves of the same broken heart. Maybe it was because he had once dreamed of raising a daughter, and now, here were two, alone in the middle of nowhere. He glanced up and down the road. No wagon tracks, no footprints, no sign of anyone nearby. Whoever had left them here was long gone, or worse. "You got any family?" He tried again. Still nothing. He sighed and ran a hand over his face. He had nothing, no money, no home, no food to spare. But he couldn't ride away. He couldn't just leave them there, like that. If he did, he'd never sleep again. His conscience, already heavy with regret, would crush him under the weight of this final failure. So, without another word, he extended his hand, and after a long, motionless pause, the girl with the doll reached out and took it. The ride into town was slow and quiet. Jim kept glancing over his shoulder to make sure the girls were still balanced on Rusty's back. Their small arms looped tightly around each other, their expressions unreadable. He had wrapped an old bed around their shoulders to block the wind, and every now and then, he heard a sniffle, maybe from the cold, maybe from sorrow. Neither of them had spoken a word since he'd found them. Not a name, not a question. Just silence, thick and fragile. The town of Dry Creek wasn't much to look at, just a main street with a general store, a blacksmith, a jailhouse, and a weather-beaten saloon that looked like it had seen more brawls than repairs. A few horses were tied up outside the post office. Dust blew through the street in lazy swirls, and townsfolk moved with the kind of wariness that said they'd seen too much to be friendly. Jim didn't blame them. In places like this, trouble always arrived on horseback. As he led Rusty down the main drag, people noticed. Eyes peeked from behind curtains. A couple of men on the boardwalk slowed their conversation and turned to stare. A woman near the store clutched her child's hand and crossed to the other side. No one said anything outright, but the message was clear. Don't make yourself at home. Jim didn't care. He wasn't looking for sympathy, just food, a roof, and maybe a place to figure out what the hell he was supposed to do with two silent girls who looked like they'd been forgotten by the whole world. He guided Rusty to the hitching post in front of the saloon and helped the girls down carefully. They stepped onto the wooden planks like they weren't sure their legs would hold them. He crouched to their level. "I need to go inside," he said gently. "We'll get you some food, maybe warm up a bit." One of the girls blinked. The other just looked down at her boots. "You stick close to me, all right? Don't talk to anyone you don't trust." He led them up the creaking steps and pushed open the swinging doors. The inside of the saloon hit him like a wall hot. Noisy, thick with cigar smoke and the sour smell of stale beer. A piano player was plinking out an off-key tune near the far wall. A card game was in full swing at a central table, with coins clinking and curses flying. At the bar, two cowhands were arguing over the difference between whiskey drunk and supper drunk. And judging by the way they were swaying, they knew both firsthand. Heads turned the moment Jim walked in with his worn hat, trail dust, coat, and two wide-eyed girls shadowing his boots. It was the kind of entrance that made people pause mid-drink. Even the piano stopped. The noise didn't die completely, but it faltered, like a train slowing just before a wreck. "Since when do we run a daycare?" someone muttered from the back. A few snickers followed. Jim felt the weight of the room settle onto his back like another pack he didn't ask to carry. He kept his eyes forward and guided the girls to a corner table away from the bar. They sat, stiffly, side by side, hands in their laps. He motioned to the barkeep, 3 bowls of stew, if it's hot, and water. The bartender, a balding man with grease stains on his shirt and a scar over one eye, raised a brow. "They yours?" Jim didn't answer, just pulled a couple of coins from his coat and dropped them on the counter. The barkeep shrugged and went to fetch the food. That's when it started. The whispering. A few men leaned into each other, chuckling. A blonde woman in a red dress leaned over to a man beside her and said something behind a gloved hand. The man barked out a laugh and pointed toward the girls. One of the drunk cowhands at the bar called out, "Hey, Cowboy, they gonna do tricks for supper or just beg like the rest of us?" Another added, "Maybe they'll sing us a lullaby." The laughter grew louder. Jim's jaw tightened. He didn't move. The girls stared down at the table like they could disappear if they just looked hard enough. The one with the ragdoll clutched it so tight her knuckles turned white. Jim stood, slowly, and turned to face the saloon. "You've all had your say," he said, his voice calm but heavy. "Now shut up and eat your damn supper." The room quieted a little, more out of surprise than respect. He sat back down, slow and deliberate. The girls hadn't moved. The silence that had settled over the saloon didn't last long. It never did in places like that where men drank to forget. Women laughed to survive, and music served as a smokescreen for sorrow. The moment Jim sat back down beside the girls, the whispering resumed, low, mean-spirited murmurs curling through the tobacco haze like snakes in dry grass. Some voices were mocking, some curious, others just cruel for the sport of it. None of it surprised Jim. He'd seen the way folks acted when they didn't understand something, and few things were more unsettling to rough men than too small, silent girls staring straight ahead like ghosts. Jim lowered his hat to shield his eyes and spoke, just loud enough for the girls to hear. "Don't pay them no mind. They bark loud, but most of them don't bite." One of the girls, the one with dark curls that fell into her eyes, glanced at him for the first time since they'd sat. There was a flicker of something behind that gaze, not trust, not yet, but something alive. It was gone in a second. Their stew arrived in 3 dented tin bowls. The meat was stringy, the broth thin, but it was hot. The girls ate quietly, carefully, like food was something they still weren't sure belonged to them. They used the wooden spoons like they might break if pressed too hard. Jim watched them, remembering the way his own son used to slurp his stew, loud and messy, always asking for more bread before he was even halfway done. That memory stung. He looked away. It was the piano player who broke the next silence. He started playing again, a lazy, tired tune that drifted around the room like smoke. It was an old waltz, something from before the war, and for a few brief seconds, it seemed to ease the tension in the air. People returned to their drinks. Dice clattered again. Laughter began to rise. But not from the table in the corner. The girls had finished eating. The one with the ragdoll, he was starting to think of her as the younger twin. Though they looked so alike, it was hard to tell, held it in her lap like a charm. Her sister sat straighter now, her fingers tapping against the table in rhythm. With the piano, Jim noticed the movement and raised an eyebrow. "You know that song?" he asked. The girl didn't answer, but her tapping grew stronger, more certain. Then, without warning, she began to hum. It was soft, so soft it was almost drowned out by the creak of a floorboard, the clink of glass. But it was there, a note held just long enough to make the hairs on Jim's arms stand up. Then the other girl joined in, her voice sliding beneath her sister's like a shadow following the sun. The effect was immediate and strange. The piano player, who'd been staring into his drink more than at the keys, looked up. He paused mid-note. A few nearby patrons glanced toward the corner table, puzzled that the girls didn't stop. The humming grew into melodies, low, haunting, and impossibly pure. No words yet, Just two voices weaving together in a harmony that didn't seem like it should come from such small, quiet beings. It was the kind of sound that made a man remember things he thought he'd forgotten: his mother's hand, stroking his hair. A lullaby hummed under candlelight, the scent of bread in a kitchen now long gone. And then, they sang, not loud, not showy, but clear, unshaken. The lyrics were simple. Something old and aching about a river that never stopped flowing. About stars that waited in the night sky for someone to come home. Their voices lifted and dipped with emotion far beyond their years, each note sharpened by whatever pain they'd carried on that long road alone. The saloon went quiet again. Not because someone demanded it, not because of fear. Because no one wanted to interrupt whatever miracle was unfolding in that smoke-choked room. A man with a scarred cheek lowered his drink, blinking slowly. A card player dropped his hand of aces onto the table, forgetting the bet. Even the woman in the red dress stopped fanning herself, her expression softening to something almost childlike. Jim didn't move. He watched the girls with a stillness he hadn't felt in years. They weren't just singing, they were healing something. In him, in the room, maybe even in themselves. The final note from the girls' song hovered in the air, like dust caught in sunlight, glowing still, suspended in silence. Not the kind of silence born of boredom or discomfort, but something deeper, reverent, the sort of stillness that follows a miracle. For a long moment, the entire saloon held its collective breath, every soul there pinned in place by the purity of what they had just heard. No one moved, no one dared speak. It was as if the very walls of the building were afraid to creak and ruin the echo of something too beautiful to be real. In that sacred hush, even the roughest men forgot their drinks, their cards, their old grudges. The saloon, normally filled with the constant noise of glasses clinking, boots scraping, laughter and hollering, had transformed into a chapel of sorts. Not a religious one, but a human one. A place where the hardened had been softened, and the cynical left without words. The younger twin, the one who held her rag doll like it was a lifeline, sat perfectly still. Her wide brown eyes scanned the room cautiously. She didn't smile. She didn't flinch. Her sister, a little taller and sharper in the jawline, had gone pale. She looked like someone who had accidentally let something escape from deep inside her, and now didn't know how to put it back. Jim saw it all. Every flicker of their emotion. He knew that look, not from children, but from soldiers. Men who had carried something locked up for too long, and finally let it out. Only to realize that release didn't always come with relief. Sometimes it left you emptier. The piano player sat motionless, hands still poised above the keys. The bartender, who just moments ago had been wiping glasses with a greasy rag, had forgotten his chore entirely. He leaned on the counter now, lips parted, eyes shimmering. It was the old man in the corner who moved first. He had been sitting alone for hours, sipping cheap whiskey and watching life pass by. Now he stood, hat pressed to his chest, and gave a single nod toward the girls. He didn't say a word, just nodded, like he was saluting something sacred. Then, one by one, the rest of the saloon began to stir. Not with mockery, not with disbelief, but with something rare and almost childlike wonder. Slow, uncertain clapping began. It started with a woman in a faded green dress, seated near the window. She brought her hands together once, then again. The sound echoed light, almost shy. Then another joined in, and another. Soon the saloon, that grimy, noisy place of tired men and hardened women, was filled with applause. But this applause was different. It wasn't loud or performative. It was soft, respectful, like the audience had just heard the truth, and were afraid to shatter it by clapping too hard. Jim looked down at the girls. They weren't smiling. They weren't soaking in praise. If anything, they looked confused. As if they didn't understand why anyone was clapping. As if they didn't know they'd done something worth applause. The older one lowered her eyes. The younger looked to Jim for reassurance. He met their gaze, gave a slow nod, and said quietly, "You sang from the soul. That's more than most ever give." The bartender finally stirred. He cleared his throat and wiped his eyes with the back of his hand like he was brushing away sawdust. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "Never thought I'd hear anything like that in this place." "I don't think any of us did," the piano player said softly. He stood and gave the girls a long, respectful look. "You know, back in New Orleans, I used to play with a woman who sang like that. She was born in a brothel, raised on scraps and sorrow. But when she sang, you swore God himself leaned in to listen." The barkeep gestured toward the empty stage near the far wall. It was dusty, unused, mostly home to spiderwebs and abandoned bar stools. "You girls ever want to sing again?" he said. "That stage is yours." A man at the poker table leaned back in his chair, arms crossed over his chest. "That wasn't just singing," he said. "That was truth, plain and raw." Another voice chimed in. "They sang like they've lived 100 lives." "Maybe they have," said a woman near the bar. She looked at the girls with something close to awe. Some voices come from the throat. Theirs came from somewhere deeper. Jim remained silent through all of it, letting the crowd absorb what had happened, letting the girls see, maybe for the first time in their young lives, that the world was capable of kindness. Eventually, the applause faded. Conversation returned, but it was quieter now, more measured, as if no one wanted to disturb the magic too much. The girls sat close to each other, their shoulders touching. They hadn't said a word, but something in their posture had changed. They weren't shrinking into themselves anymore. They weren't hiding, they were present, grounded. The older twin finally looked up at Jim. "Why did they clap?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Because you gave them something real," Jim said. "And folks don't forget real when they hear it." The girl blinked. "They didn't laugh." "No," Jim said, gently. "They didn't. They always laugh." Jim's jaw tightened at that. He didn't ask who they were. He didn't need to. "You're not with them anymore," he said. "You're with me." There was a long pause. The younger twin rested her head on her sister's shoulder, and for the first time, her grip on the ragdoll loosened just a little. Someone brought over 2 mugs of warm milk and left them on the table without saying a word. Jim looked up to thank the stranger, but saw no one standing nearby. Just the milk, a quiet gift. The girls drank slowly. They didn't speak, but Jim could feel the shift in them. A door opening, a wall cracking. He wondered how many nights they had gone without food, how many days without kindness, how long they had wandered before he found them under that mesquite tree. He thought about all the places he'd seen in his years. Mining towns, cattle trails, battlefields. But he had never seen a room change so completely in such a short time. Never seen hard men soften without force. Never seen silence become a gift, not a punishment. He thought about his wife, about the child he'd lost, and for just a breath, he imagined how different things might have been if they had lived. If the ranch had survived, if he hadn't spent years running from ghosts. But then he looked at the girls again and realized, maybe he hadn't lost everything. Maybe he'd been led to this moment for a reason. When they finished their milk, the girls sat back and looked around the saloon again. No one jeered, no one sneered. In fact, a few people smiled. A man near the entrance even tipped his hat to them. Jim stood, tossing a few more coins onto the table. "Come on," he said gently. "Time we found a place to sleep." The barkeep called after him. "Jim, you need a room. Upstairs is open. Take the corner one quietest we got." Jim nodded his thanks, and the girls followed him upstairs without hesitation. In the quiet of the room, with the door shut and the lamp flickering low, Jim sat on the edge of the bed while the girls curled up together on the cot across from him. Their breathing slowed, their eyes fluttered shut, and for the first time since he found them, they looked at peace. Jim leaned back, staring at the cracked ceiling. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but tonight, he felt something he hadn't felt in years.